This panel is organized by Platypus. The Platypus Affiliated Society was founded in December 2006. We organize reading groups, public fora, journalism, and film screenings at different campuses in New York, Boston, Toronto, Frankfurt, and Germany. And in Chicago, where we have chapters at the University of Chicago, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, Loyola University, and UIC. Please talk to me after the panel to find out more about upcoming activities. You can also visit our website, platypus1917.org, to find out more. Recent scholarship has offered us a distinctively contemporary Frankfurt school. Philosophically akin to post-structuralism, politically post-Marxist, and aesthetically post-modern. Hoping to translate its concern and vocabulary into the present day, critical theory has been domesticated, defanged. This panel recovers an unfamiliar, even dangerous Frankfurt school. Re-examining its key projects and thinkers, we find a critical theory that can shed new light upon the buried projects of modernism and emancipatory Marxism. Our panelists today are Chris Cutrone, who is a doctoral candidate in the program on the history of culture at the University of Chicago. He's also a lecturer in the Department of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And he's also a lecturer in the Social Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. Next we have Marcus Breen, who is a new addition to our panel, who's a professor of communications at Northeastern University. Then we have Jeremy Cohen, who is a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at New York University. And finally we have Ben Shepard, who holds a bachelor's in philosophy from the University of Chicago and is an independent scholar based in Los Angeles. The format today will be that each of the panelists will give presentations under 20 minutes. We won't take any interruptions in between. Afterwards, we'll give all of the panelists 3 minutes to respond to each other's work. Then we'll open the floor to discussion. Although I realize that the conference organizers have made these panels in 1.5 hour blocks. I'm planning on staying somewhat later, at least until we're done and have finished our discussion. So since this kind of bleeds into lunch, I hope that you won't mind staying past 1:30 or 12:30 rather. So without further ado, turn it over to Chris.
Okay. The scholar of Benjamin Adorno's work, Susan Buckmorse, in her response to the October Art Journal 1996 Visual Culture Questionnaire, provided a pithy formulation for defining the tasks of both art and criticism in the modern era. Quote, "Artists' work is to sustain the critical moment of aesthetic experience. Our job as critics is to recognize this." Close quote. Two aspects of Buckmorse's formulation of the work of artists needs to be emphasized: sustaining the critical moment and aesthetic experience. The subjective experience of the aesthetic is what artists work on, and they do so in order to capture and sustain or make available subjectivity's critical moment. Adorno, in his 1932 essay on the social situation of music, analogized the position of modern art to that of critical social theory. The role of both was to provoke recognition. Furthermore, Adorno warned that there can be no progress in art without that of society. Adorno's posthumously published but unfinished monograph, Aesthetic Theory, can be considered to have a central theme organizing all its discussion of the modern experience of art: the simultaneous necessity and impossibility of art. In this, Adorno was elaborating, in the aesthetic realm, his thesis in negative dialectics, the simultaneous necessity and impossibility of philosophy and of critical theory itself. What does it mean to practice art in an epoch of its simultaneous continuing necessity and impossibility? A clue can be found in Adorno's claim in Negative Dialectics that, quote, "philosophy lives on because its moment of realization was missed." Adorno's treatment of philosophy and art are modeled on Marx's treatment of capital. The potential for a dialectical historical transformation in which capital would be simultaneously realized and abolished became for Adorno the question of what it would mean to simultaneously realize and overcome the aspirations of modern philosophy and art. What would it mean to overcome the necessity that is expressed in modern practices of art? The Hegelian thought figure of art's attaining to its own concept while transcending it through a qualitative transformation was mobilized by Adorno to grasp both the history of modern art and the desire to overcome its practices. The Hegel scholar Robert Pippin, in his response to the 2003 critical inquiry journal Forum on the Current State and Potential Future for Critical Theory, described postmodernism as a repetition of the Romantic recoil from modernity. Specifically, Pippin pointed to modern literary and artistic forms as derived from such Romanticism, of which postmodernism was the mere continuation, but in denial of its repetition. But Pippin also pointed out that such repetition is in fact a regression, because consciousness of the historical condition of the problem had grown worse. Hegel had posed the question of the end of art. Excuse me. But Hegel meant by this not the cessation of practices of art, but rather their ability to make the activity of spirit appear in a self-contained manner. While religion, in Hegel's view, had been superseded by art, art had come to be superseded by philosophy. What did Hegel mean by this? Nothing but that art needed philosophical interpretation to be able to mean what it meant. Art needed criticism in order to be itself. This was a specifically modern condition for art, which Hegel addressed in a rather optimistic manner, seeing such need for criticism in art as a hallmark of enlightenment rather than a disability for art. But Adorno took this Hegelianism of art and turned it from a historical explanation of its condition into a critique of such circumstances of history. Like Marx, who had turned Hegel on his head or put Hegel back on his feet, Adorno inverted the significance of Hegel's philosophical observation. Where Hegel had, for instance, regarded modern politics as the realm of reflection on and the self-objectification of civil society in the state, Marx regarded the modern state and civil society distinction as expressing a pathological necessity of capital, in which the self-contradiction of capital was projected. Adorno similarly addressed the complementary necessities of art and criticism as expressing a self-contradiction in aesthetic subjectivity. As Adorno put it, however, this did not mean that one should aspire to a reconciliation of art and philosophy or theory. Just as Marx critiqued the left Hegelians for their romantic desire to dissolve the distinction between state and civil society, the separation was regarded by Marx and Adorno alike as the hallmark of freedom. In a late essay, The Marginalia on Theory and Praxis, from 1969, Adorno attacked what he called romantic socialism for wanting to dissolve the distinction and critical relationship between theory and practice, maintaining that, by contrast with traditional society, the modern separation of theory and practice was progressive and emancipatory. So was the separation in meaning between art as non-conceptual knowledge and criticism informed by theoretical concepts. So Adorno, like Marx, looked forward, not to a return to a pre-modern or pre-capitalist unity of theory and practice and reconciliation of form and content, as had been the case in traditional culture, but rather a qualitative transformation of the modern division of meaning in art and criticism, in which each would be simultaneously realized and abolished as presently practiced. The problem is that rather than being raised to ever more acute levels, already in Adorno's lifetime, there was a retreat from the productive antagonism, the dialectic, if you will, of theory and practice, or of art and criticism. Adorno drew upon and sought to further elaborate the approach of his friend and mentor, Walter Benjamin, who argued in his 1934 essay, The Author as Producer, that no art could be of correct political tendency unless it was also of good aesthetic quality. Furthermore, Benjamin argued that every great work of art either founds or dissolves a genre. As Benjamin put it, the work of art that fails to teach artists teaches no one. Artists do not distribute aesthetic experience, but rather produce it. New art reworks and transforms retrospectively the history of art. Benjamin argued that there could be no progress in society without that of art, for necessarily involved in both is the transformation of subjectivity. The history of modern art, as Benjamin and Adorno recognized, presents a diverse multiplicity of practices, none of which have been able to come to full fruition. Benjamin described this poignantly in his Arcades project as living in hell. Benjamin and Adorno's thought figure for such historical consciousness of modern art comes from Trotsky, who pointed out in a 1938 letter to the editors of the American journal Partisan Review that the modern capitalist epoch displayed the following phenomenon in its historical course. This is Trotsky. New tendencies take on a more and more violent character, alternating between hope and despair. The artistic schools of the first few decades of the 20th century, Cubism, Futurism, Dadaism, Surrealism, follow each other without reaching a complete development. Art, which is the most complex part of culture, the most sensitive and at the same time the least protected, suffers most from the decline and decay of bourgeois society. This was because, as Trotsky put it, the decline of bourgeois society means an intolerable exacerbation of social contradictions, which are transformed inevitably into personal contradictions, calling forth an ever more burning need for a liberating art. Furthermore, a declining capitalism already finds itself completely incapable of offering the minimum conditions for the development of tendencies in art which correspond, however little, to our epoch. The oppressed masses live their own life. Bohemianism offers too limited a social base. Close quote. Or actually continues a little bit. Trotsky said of art that, quote, a protest against reality, either conscious or unconscious, active or passive, optimistic or pessimistic, always forms part of a really creative piece of work. Every new tendency in art has begun with rebellion, close quote. And not merely rebellion against existing conventions of art, but rather the greater conditions of life in capitalist modernity. So what would be a liberating art? Adorno addresses this in terms of the aspiration for what he called artistic autonomy, or the self-justification of aesthetic experience. This is related to how Kant had described the experience of the beautiful in nature or art as the sympathetic resonance the subject experiences of an object, which thus appears to embody what Kant called purposiveness without purpose, or a telos, or an end in itself. Except, for Adorno, this empathy between subject and object, in Kant's account of aesthetic experience, is not to be affirmative, but rather critical. In Adorno's account of the modern experience of art, the subject recognizes not the power of experiential capacities and the transformative freedom of the human faculties, but rather their constraint and unfreedom, their self-contradictory and self-undermining powers. The subject experiences not its freedom in self-transformation, but rather the need for transformation in freedom. Adorno emphasized that the autonomy of art, as of the subject, remains under capitalism an aspiration rather than an achieved state. Works of art embody a striving for autonomy that is denied the subject of the modern society of capital, and thus also embody the failure of this aspiration. Hence, the history of art furnishes a rich inventory of failed attempts. This is why its history is unsettled and constantly returns. Modern works of art are necessarily failures, but are nonetheless valuable as embodiments of possibility, of unfulfilled potential. The constrained possibilities embodied in modern art are, according to Benjamin's formulation, approached by the subject with a combination of desire and fear. Modern artworks embody not only human, but inhuman potentials, or, rather, the possibilities for the qualitative transformation of humanity, which of course we desire and fear in equal measure. They thus have simultaneously utopian and dystopian aspects. Modern artworks are as ambivalent as the historical conditions they refract in themselves prismatically. But it is in such ambivalence that art instantiates freedom. It is the task of theory, or critique, to register an attempt to bring the non-conceptual within the range of concepts, as Adorno put it. The aspiration of modern art is to produce something without knowing what it is. In so doing, art acts not only on the future, but also on history. Modern artworks find inspiration in art history. This is the potentially emancipatory character of repetition. Artists are motivated by art history to re-attain lost moments by achieving them again, however differently. Artists produce new works that, in their newness, unlock the potentials of past art, allowing us to re-experience history. But this work on history is not without its dangers. As Benjamin put it, even the dead are not safe. They're not safe from the ambivalent progress of history, which unfolds in capital as a mounting catastrophe, according to Benjamin. The history of modern art, like that of capital more generally, furnishes a compendium of ruins. The simultaneously progressive and regressive dynamics of history find their purchase in this, that historical forms of experience and consciousness inform present practices, for better or for worse. It is the work of critique to attempt to better inform, through greater consciousness, the inevitable repetition in the continuing practices of art, and thus attempt to overcome the worst effects of the regression involved in such practices. In the Hegelian sense adopted by both Marx and Adorno, the greater consciousness of freedom is the only available path for freedom's possible realization. Consciousness is tasked to recognize the potential that is its own condition of possibility. This is why Adorno and Benjamin addressed works of art as forms of consciousness. Art can be ideological, or it can enlighten, provoking consciousness to push itself further. The dialectic of art and criticism is necessary for the vitality of art. The self-abnegation of criticism, the disenchantment of consciousness that characterized postmodernism, has clearly demonstrated the barrenness of such abdication of responsibility, on the part of critics and theorists, even more than artists, who were thus left at the mercy of poor, unclarified concepts. The challenge posed by modern critical theoretical approaches to art have been warded off rather than engaged and pushed further. Artists' work continues to demand critical recognition, whether the critics recognize this or not. What such critical recognition of the work of history taken up by art would mean is what Marxist critical theorists such as Adorno and Benjamin pursued, and from whose efforts we can and indeed must still learn. For a new condition of art has not been attained, but only an old set of conditions repeated, however without their being properly recognized. The relation between art and social modernity, or capital, continues to task both art and theory. Art is not merely conditioned by, but is itself an instance of the modern society of capital. But like society, for art to progress, theory must do its work.
Thank you. Well, thank you for including me on this panel with short notice. And I have to say that as an Australian, platypus is a particularly valued creature. We grow up being socialised by not only living in a strange continent, but having a creature that consists of characteristics that include a duck, a kangaroo, a bird, of course, and a rabbit.
Don't forget the venom.
The what?
The venom.
The venomous, that's right, hook on the mail. You may well ask what that has to do with critical theory, and you'll just have to keep on asking because I have no idea. I'm very pleased to be here, as I've said, and the topic of my paper is Liberal Conceits Collapsing Cultural Certainties. It was originally scheduled for a paper tomorrow, but I'm on another panel talking about teaching cultural studies at the same time, and we're still in a state where it's impossible for a human being to be in one place, two places at one time. So here I am. And I'm very pleased with the orientation towards Benjamin, because being a late addition to this panel, I wasn't prepared to take on Benjamin. It just so happens that my discussion of liberal conceits incorporates Benjamin. So what do you know? The platypus is talking for me. Now, I want to talk, in approaching this concept of liberal conceits, I want to talk about the changes that are taking place in the culture and why cultural studies should take note of this, and what I think is an important point for what might be intervention in terms of both our academic lives, but also in terms of the way in which we think about how we are located both within the academy and as what I'd like to think of in a Gramscian sense as organic intellectuals, deeply connected to the culture in which we live. sometimes we kind of forget that we actually do live in a culture, and it's worth commenting on the culture in which we live, which we embody, and we kind of forget. We do that. In talking about liberalism then, what is it? Of course, the old definitional questions are pretty important, and I'm relying on Michael Sandel. Some of you may know Michael Sandel or of his work. He's a Harvard-based social scientist, philosopher. Forgive him for being in such an elite organisation, but he is a very good scholar of liberalism, and his orientation is in trying to map the changes in liberalism, and what he's come up with is this phrase, which is well established now, and which I'm going to use as part of the basis for my definition of liberalism, which is the idea of a rights-based structure. Liberalism is rights-based, and of course I trained, one of the things I trained in as an undergraduate was history, and of course when we heard about medieval history and then the transition through the Reformation and the Renaissance of Henry VIII and his introduction of a form of liberalism and his conflict with Thomas More and so on, we heard about this phrase of open tolerance, and I've always valued that notion. Liberalism is open tolerance. And so I want to start at that point, this lovely kind of image, if you like, in your mind's eye of Henry VIII and his gowns and his multiple wives and his high-mindedness about authority, but his claims to open tolerance seem to me to be are still appealing to me, and they were to me as a young undergraduate. So John Stuart Mill set the ground for our more rigorous notions of liberalism, and of course his notion really went to concepts about general welfare and utilitarianism. If it's good for everybody, it'll be okay. So it kind of relates to Henry VIII. I'm not going to detail this, but Immanuel Kant, of course, then moved a little bit away from Mill's notion of utilitarianism, and he moved from ideas about, or he conflated, if you like, notions of rights with the good of general welfare. And as Sandel describes it in summary, Kantian liberalism is characterised by, and this is important, the refusal to affirm a preferred way of life or conception of the good. A refusal to affirm a preferred way of life or conception of the good. If you've read Kant, it's fascinating, and if you've read Foucault on Kant, it's not quite as fascinating. But the point is that what's become important is that rights have been given a priority within our dominant framework. And so what we've allowed to happen in liberalism, and I'm sorry I've leapt from the 16th and 15th centuries to 2011, I have to excuse my sense of history there, but rights, we've basically allowed the ascendancy of rights over utilitarianism. Of course there's a struggle, but there's a sense of this notion of how we give rights. Now, there are all sorts of illustrations for how we give rights, but this is what I say, we embody some of these ideas, and we hear them in the culture, we hear them in songs, in popular music, we see them and hear them in statements by, current Secretary of State, forever on television telling us about rights. She wouldn't know a right if it ran over her, but anyway, we have people claiming that they know what rights are all the time. But in a sense, all we're hearing is the refusal to affirm a preferred way, it seems to me, and that seems to be an important principle about contemporary liberalism. What it does, what that introductory sense does for me is to raise some questions about the ascendancy of rights, and the questions are always prevailing in philosophy. Marx raised them, Kant raised them, Thorstein Veblen raised them, John Commons, the initiator of institutional economics, which I tend to do work in, talked a lot about them, particularly in his essay called Institutional Economics, and that is fundamentally the prevailing question is, does the individual or the collective have the greatest claim to rights? Who has the claim to rights? Who determines, or what determines, individual rights? And are individuals superior in the judgments that they make about the rights that they should have? Or is the collective superior? Are collectives, or communitarians, as philosophers would say, better able to define rights and identify rights? This is the question, of course, for people on the left, and especially for those who believe in a state-based system of organisation. Does a communitarian approach, and you only have to listen to the Tea Party to get some insights on this, does a communitarian approach to rights assume the suppression of individual freedoms? These are huge questions, it seems to me. You may disagree with me, I don't care if you do, or you don't. I'm here to discuss these issues and debate them with you. But they are fundamental not only to our tradition of trying to understand liberalism, trying to understand this notion of open tolerance within our society, but also the structure of our society and the struggle within our society. The question for cultural studies is, why don't we talk about this more? Why don't we have a clear argument about the conflict between individual rights and collective rights? Because if we did, I think we would get to some of the substance about what liberalism might be. So I think there's a struggle over these notions, particularly over the notion of communitarian good. There's absolutely no doubt that the struggle is very clear. Now, returning in a more friendly way to Foucault, I think what he was doing when he was claiming an association, if you like, or an affiliation with Kantian notions, he was trying to break open this possible struggle by saying, look, if we can approach Kant in a non-deterministic way, we can imagine that we'll kind of end up with a discursive approach where it will always be open-ended. We won't have any closure about whether there's individual rights or communitarian rights. My point, my thesis, is that we're now at a point in history, a point in the culture, where it might be necessary to think about closing the notion of rights. It's no longer open-ended. It's no longer an infinity on the horizon. Now, you may say, you may be thinking, where the hell is this guy going with this? And what I want to do is to suggest that one of the reasons we need to progress this thinking is because our thoughts about rights, our thoughts about liberalism, our thoughts about open toleration have got us into an end game, if you like, where what we are practicing is conceits. The certainties about our rights, the certainties and the security that we have in the claims that we are always making about the rights that we as individuals have. And these play out on a daily basis. The right to gay marriage, unproblematic, we all agree, apparently. And the Tea Party folk will tell you about their rights. And the governor of various states to the west of us will tell us about other rights. They're all contained within the fundamental questions about communitarian and individual rights, and I think they're all challenged by this question of what liberalism means and what this rights reading of individualism means. But more importantly, I think the questions that I'm interested in are how claims to rights then have a materiality. And the claims to rights of materiality are things like consumption, consumerism. Now I talk to my students about some of these things, and it really gets personal. It's very private. When I booked my aeroplane ticket, I didn't for a minute think I shouldn't come to this conference, right? But, in coming to this conference, I'm just adding to the revenue of American Airlines, probably people I wouldn't want to be in the same room with. But more importantly, polluting the skies, adding to the number of aeroplanes in the sky, unbelievable kind of commitment on my behalf to incredibly destructive day-to-day, everyday actions within the culture. And I think for most of us, and Andrew Ross has made this point, for most of us, what we would do to change our behaviour wouldn't change anything at all, right? Not getting on an aeroplane wouldn't mean that the aeroplane would not fly. If enough of us perhaps suggested that we do that, then it might bring some significant change to the number of aeroplanes flying. But generally speaking, we consider this our rights. So on an everyday level, at which cultural studies should be interested, rights play out in this kind of articulation with larger scale notions of what it means, for example, to be a middle class academic American attending cultural studies conferences. Problematising these kinds of things. As I say, these are personal and they're political. How do we reimagine rights when we start to think of them like that? Well, that's some questions that I wanted to raise, and to follow on from where Chris was talking, I want to suggest that these rights and the notion of rights are becoming more and more powerful and more important to think about, not only because of the environmental crisis and the financial crisis and every other crisis in which we are currently struggling, but because I think that we're now in a place where we can see that we have so many rights and so many different interests are claiming their rights, and yet to a large extent some things in terms of a progressive agenda are not happening, like radical changes to environmentalism. In fact, you know the statistic that there are now more people who do not believe in global warming than a year or two ago did believe in it, did accept it. So we're going backwards in terms of, you know, thoughts about whether or not we'll be swimming to our conferences in a few years, or all living on Noah's Ark again, or whatever, or his sister.
As long as we get two platypi.
It's exactly, you'd be fine. That's right. So one of the things that's reinforcing and excavating, if you like, and exposing the notion of claims to rights that are being made is the internet. And I just want to quickly make a couple of comments. The availability and the free flow of information, free in inverted commas of course, but the flow of information globally from anybody, unregulated, rapidly moving at a global level is dramatic and huge. And there was a time, I've been around for a while and I've worked in the communications industry and the film industry, and but mostly in and around IT. And there was a time in the early 90s where, before the internet bubble came and then went again, the internet was going to be the great salvation for this free flow of information, and everything was going to be wonderful. In some ways that happened, putting aside questions about the digital divide and such likes and information divides. It's pretty much happened, and we have this vast circulation of information. But that information, of course, and that knowledge is coming from places that were not anticipated. And my book I've got coming out called Uprising the Internet's Unintended Consequences deals with this. What I wanted to suggest, going back to Walter Benjamin, is that what we're seeing and what Benjamin talks about right at the end of the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, perhaps to take the point that Chris made, the kind of fear that might be invoked, particularly that last comment of Benjamin's in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. What does he say? Basically, we're going to be left with some kind of proletarianisation. So I've taken that notion of proletarianisation as he's re-invoked it, not in an economistic notion or in an economistic sense, but in a sense in which Benjamin uses it or suggests it. That is, that the media, cinema, the magnification of everyday life, of complete domination by capital, is now the prevailing model or mode The internet merely reinforces and amplifies that to expose us all to everything about the internal workings of our lives and reduces us with that knowledge and that information. So it's a counter kind of argument to say that proletarianisation is coming to us through the internet, and it is the exposure of the totality of human misery and, of course, human greatness, human achievement. So a fundamentally dialectical reading of it. But the proletarianisation aspect, of course, is, as taken from Benjamin, is mostly around the perspective of fear of the otherwise unknown and the unrecognised. My interest in trying to link or articulate liberal conceits and the internet and proletarianisation is a kind of a thought experiment, if you like, a theoretical experiment. Unfortunately, the title of this panel is going against the grain, so I want to kind of suggest that what liberal conceits as a phrase suggests is that liberalism is seriously in trouble. Liberalism needs to be rethought and redefined within the culture, within our field of cultural studies, and that the internet can be the tool for allowing us to think about liberalism and to think about how a rights-based society is deeply problematic. And I'll finish on a personal note. It's problematic because I, actually speaking strictly for myself, would not want to live under a regime managed by, let's say, the Tea Party and their rights. And yet what we have in the Tea Party is a form of proletarianisation. We can see how they're organised. We can observe their uneducated, ignorant, bogus claims to a kind of massive claim to individual rights, regardless of the value of welfare and welfare statism, regardless of the value of communitarianism, regardless of the value of anything apart from their own selfish self-interest. You may agree or disagree with that perspective. I think if you're on the left, we've also got to work out, and I am, and you've got to work out then how that plays out in terms of larger political struggles. And I'm one of those people who is has been very outspoken, both in policy and in cultural studies generally, on about the importance of recognising that in cultural studies we're in a political project. Thank you.
My paper is called Foucault's Detours. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes from Foucault. The first one is in an interview with Foucault, Structuralism and Post-Structuralism. I quote, "Now, obviously, if I had been familiar with the Frankfurt School, if I had been aware of it at the time, I would not have said a number of stupid things that I did say, and I would have avoided many of the detours which I made while trying to pursue my own humble path, when, meanwhile, avenues had been opened up by the Frankfurt School." And then the second quote, end quote. Second quote is from Foucault's essay, this kind of ties in, segues. What is enlightenment? Quote goes, "The principle of a critique and a permanent creation of ourselves and our autonomy. That is, a principle at the heart of the historical consciousness that the Enlightenment has of itself." End quote. Near the end of his life, Foucault began to reconsider his work's relationship to both the Frankfurt School and to the Enlightenment, or, to take the highest figures, Adorno and Kant. Habermas's critique was an impetus, of course. But by recontextualizing his intellectual work, Foucault did not just defend, he embarked on a self-critique. He died before he could pursue these insights very far, but the affinity he noticed, with the critique it implied, ought to provoke an overall reconsideration of Foucault and his legacy. These two scattered remarks that I offer you today are the beginning of an attempt to take Foucault's statement seriously, examining what in Foucault's work, on his account as well as more generally, finds resonance with the Frankfurt School as itself an inheritor and critic of the Enlightenment. I will try to take Foucault's invitation and identify several rather serious detours his thought took due to these lapses. Several of Foucault's most influential legacies, his focus on microhistory, governmentality and institutions, his ruthless pessimism vis-à-vis the development of the rational subject, his metaphysics of power and resistance, needs must be radically reconsidered in light of these detours. Have we so loved Foucault because of his path, or have we fetishized his detours? Through the juxtaposition of these three, Foucault, Kant, Adorno, I will revisit Foucault as a theorist of modernity and try to further his self-critique in the name of his overcoming. Especially given Foucault's suspicion of a notion of truth not tied to a particular form of life, we ought to inquire what it is about Foucault that still speaks to us in our lifetime, now. Foucault always had a sort of affected diffidence about the comprehensiveness of his own work, but in the elaboration of his oeuvre, up perhaps until the end of his life, a time which we'll discuss later, Foucault treaded much of the same ground. Foucault, self-consciously taking his cue from Nietzsche, was concerned with demonstrating that, quote, modern man was not the product of science, reason, truth, and progress, but instead represented a horrifying, squalid thing, drilled into conformity by principles and institutions of absolute control. The prospect of the last man lies in all of Foucault's work, the mood of modernity and despair. Foucault's arresting vision is centrally concerned, as philosopher Peter Deuze puts it, with, quote, a highly individual historical vision, which centers on the transition from traditional to modern industrial societies, and is specifically concerned with the forms of knowledge and modes of social organization characteristic of capitalist modernity. Foucault joins then with Marx, Weber, Durkheim, Nietzsche, and others in presenting a comprehensive view of the transformation of life in the modern era. This vision allows us to understand something qualitatively new about modern society, the increase of forms of social control, he will term this variously, governmentality, pastoral power, creative power, all under the name of enlightenment. This transformation is related to science, but not co-equal to it. Science, social relations, and self-understanding are all mutually transformed. Like these other social theorists, Foucault offers not an account of the transformation of an underlying essential man, but depicts in his two vivid images the creation of qualitatively new individuals who come to know themselves in the world. Foucault, like these other theorists, and like us, is skeptical of the grand claims of final progress our society has made about itself. The affinities between Foucault and the Frankfurt School abound. When he mentions Adorno, Horkheimer, and others, Foucault describes in the same breath Weber. Of the classical social theorists, Weber, lacking the assurances of Durkheim's positivism or the hope of Marx's transmuted German idealism, is perhaps the most gloomy. He envisions an unstoppable ascent of deeply irrational rationality, a rationality that makes human self-development the more impossible even as it would seem to increase the means for us to lay hands on our destiny. Foucault sees the Frankfurt School as in line with this critique of modern rationality as a form of domination. The, quote, administered individual is precisely, for Adorno and Horkheimer, submitted to systematic social control by enlightened means. Foucault describes himself at one point as undertaking a rational critique of reason, something very close to a self-description Adorno gave negative dialectics. The Frankfurt School insisted on the importance of Nietzsche's work. See the Juliet chapter in the Dialectic of Enlightenment and a published conversation on Nietzsche at the Institute for a criticism of modernity. This was rare among Marxists. Finally, the idea of a, quote, science of man that would look like the natural sciences was repudiated first by Lukács and then by the Frankfurt School as being unable to recognize the particular character of subject-object interaction that any human science would have to account for. For both Foucault and the Frankfurt School, these sciences descend into vapid formalism and conformist directive. We might also take Foucault's invitation to note his affinities with the Frankfurt School not just in social consciousness, but in social being as well. Foucault, importantly, is significantly less self-conscious of this than the Frankfurt School. But the conditions of all of their thought are the seeming end of ideology and the according pristine success of Enlightenment institutions. The welfare state declares itself the end of history, the only opposition are intellectually deadening Stalinist parties and states, and meanwhile the most rationalized barbarism, fascism, is the most vivid nightmare. Foucault's thinking speaks to its time perhaps even more than ours, and we will see that the thought undergoes some fundamental transformations as the world order itself changes. Because of the success of integration in enlightened societies of all that might seem to challenge the status quo, of the more or less violent taming that power inflicts on the human animal. But the Frankfurt School did recognize that integration meant also deepening violence and destruction, and new forms of social crisis, contingent upon technical progress as perverse fruits, the continual expulsion of the workers from the labor process. Indeed, we may wistfully look back at a state concerned with its citizens' welfare. Now states merely strain to maintain a tenuous social order as an agricultural population finds nothing but slums as the fruits of human history. Foucault's efforts remain to warn us against any nostalgic return to a new Keynesian order. The discontents of that period are a real appearance. But as an old joke goes, the only thing worse than being exploited by the capitalist is not being exploited by the capitalist. If the state represents some alienated way in which humans have come to form themselves, madmen expelled from mental institutions to become homeless on the streets of major cities may represent resistance, but they also represent renunciation. Foucault's most provocative claims are that the very way in which we conceive our opposition to power is only the most profound registering of its effects on us. And give several quotes. Contemporary thought, believing that it has escaped, has merely rediscovered that which made it possible. In the last years of the 18th century, European culture outlined a new structure that has not yet been unraveled. We are only just beginning to disentangle a few of the threads, which are still so unknown to us that we immediately assume them to be either marvelously new or absolutely archaic, whereas for 200 years, they have constituted the dark but firm web of our experience. Or another quote, "The irony of this apparatus is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance." The end of part 1 of the history of sexuality. Or another quote, "The state is both individualizing and totalitarian. Opposing the individual and his interest to it is just as hazardous as opposing it with the community and its requirements. Liberation can only come from attacking not just one of these two effects, but political rationality's various roots." This complicity of contemporary forms of resistance with the very power they are attempting to oppose is related to Foucault's interdiction on the possibility of global transformative politics as themselves complicit in domination. The revolutionary goal of transforming society is brother to that of the hardening of power relations all the enlightened reformers effected. If subjectivity and domination are entirely co-constitutive, as they are in most of Foucault's work, the only resistance that might escape this bind is the immediate, the unthought, which does not cohere to a project or goal. Yet Foucault does not leave us with this supreme skepticism about political activity, itself always seemingly fallen because of the necessity of accepting the very categories it sets out to oppose: sexuality, the disciplined body, the happiness of the community, etc. Foucault also says several times that he hopes with his thinking to more closely relate theory to practice, something he thinks Marxism has notoriously failed to do. The new malcontents that 68 revealed, interested in transforming everyday life and institutional structures once thought apolitical and administrative, prisons, schools, sexual practices, etc., often a new way for Foucault of thinking or not thinking about political practice. Their resistance was local and directed to specific effects of power. They are capable of strategically transforming the exercise of power and challenging the right of power to define them as what they are, rather than leaning on that definition for support. So on the one hand, we have in Foucault a terrifying hopelessness about politics, but on the other, a frenetic strategic activity at every site of power. Socialism is impossible, but the heterotopia of a brothel can disrupt the normal everyday functioning of power. There is a moment of truth in this. If the decline of political possibilities over the 20th century for dramatic transformation is evident for Foucault, most immediately in a miserable PCF whose reaction to May 68 is utter perplexity, his thought registers the sense that radical politics in its highest form, say Lukács's Marx, the Marx of self-consciousness and totality, has become bankrupt. Marxism lies exposed as system constitutive. Its political possibility then for Foucault is non-existent. But the lie asserts itself, and here Foucault's difference from Adorno is instructive. Adorno importantly directed some of his later critical effort against what he called, quote, pseudo-activity, activity that might seem to be an expression of resistance, but at the same time bore within it resignation to the overwhelming force of the status quo. Pseudo-activity is the expression both of the hope that something totally new might erupt into the world, but at the same time the renunciation of that hope, the conviction that change is in fact not possible. The politics of everyday resistance, for which Foucault gives such elaborate justifications, may then only be expressions of a one-sided view of the modern, of the world as fallen. When reading Foucault, one finds a surprising filiation with Edmund Burke. Burke lambasts the French Revolution for the destructive power of abstractions, for the horror wrought when, in the name of the human, local iterative practices are displaced by those of willful destruction. Let us not condemn Foucault for this kinship, though we may be less sanguine about a recently published paper from Columbia College that gives nary a blush when saying, yes, Burke, Foucault, yeah, totally. Instead, we might say that Foucault resonates because he grasps that the Enlightenment must appear to us right now as a failed leap. Heidegger said that he was terrified when seeing images of the Earth from outer space. Foucault must involuntarily return to Burke, must become the foe of the Enlightenment par excellence, because without the future project of reconciliation, i.e. Marxism and overcoming, that the Frankfurt School so tenuously holds out, the French Revolution, and with it all of modern history, becomes the stupid story of domination and despair, the most satanic form of the eternal power struggle that underlies Foucault's metaphysics. The aspiration to transform totality against which Foucault directs his hostility is the secret disappointed hope of his thought. But Foucault is also a thinker of importance because his thinking was capable of undergoing transformation. This is most clearly demonstrated in his important essay, What is Enlightenment? An essay that, for all its claim to continuity, can be recognized as in key ways marking a departure for Foucault's thought. Instead of the miserable modernity, the fallen world of the present, we are presented with what Foucault calls modernity as an attitude. Foucault detects this strain in Kant and Baudelaire. In Kant's short piece, Was ist der Aufklärung? What is Enlightenment? Foucault draws out the implications of a term he has used before, quote, a history of the present. Kant reflects on the present by emphasizing the breaks of the present with the past, and so implies the necessity for an account of how we came to be what we are, a historical ontology in Foucault's terms. Furthermore, the thrust of all this is to present a task for the others of Kant's generation. Maturity has not been reached. The present is meaningful only insofar as we fulfill a project of autonomy, of the self coming to determine itself by overcoming dogmatism. Foucault's project of a history of the present is shown now not to be in absolute opposition to the problem of freedom as German idealism and its inheritor Marxism had posed it. Instead, it presumes that our present is still characterized by possibilities for freedom that can only be unlocked through historical consciousness. Foucault juxtaposes Kant's Enlightenment to Baudelaire's modernity, and in Baudelaire finds theme of the difficult interplay between the truth of what is real and the exercise of freedom, and in general, a future-oriented definition of the human being as a project rather than an essence to be discovered in its eternal verity. Where modernity in Foucault before seemed to be little more than the reason cunningly perpetuating universal deception, suddenly autonomy and critique in the classical sense, critique that inquires into the possibility of the mutual determination of object and subject in freedom, comes to the fore. Nietzschean suspicion is always double-sided, in fact. Nietzsche must recognize himself as apotheosis of the Enlightenment and the defender of, among other things, the body, the passions, the absolute doubt, the immoral, etc., that Enlightenment denigrates and destroys. Foucault brings out this Nietzsche through Kant and Baudelaire. Foucault's late turn is a puzzle for many, but it shouldn't be. It is a Hegelian discovery Foucault makes. Reason, the subject, truth, freedom, these are not prejudices that can be swept away by the truly critical critic. They form part of the deepest structure of our thought because they are part of our life, because the problems of autonomy, subjectivity, and progress are posed by the very nature of our existence. This is what Marx would ultimately call capital, the form of social life that persistently poses and frustrates our attempt to reach maturity. Foucault registers this as his dissatisfaction with the blackmail of enlightenment, of being for or against. Foucault rightly registers that enlightenment, as did Nietzsche, as did Adorno and Horkheimer, must itself demand its own overcoming. But Foucault's return to Kant and Baudelaire is both perhaps his most interesting and his most problematic moment. By indicating that the French Revolution and Kant, its greatest admirer, continue to pose, as he put it, tasks on the present, Foucault recognizes that the project of critical theory and the rational critique of reason has not ended because our maturity has not been reached. But at the same time, by ignoring the intervening history between Kant and today, by shunting aside his anxieties about how the failures of Marxism redound on the worthwhileness of science, reason, etc., Foucault has to fall beneath even Kant. Take his return in this essay to his taboo on grand projects for emancipation. This isn't the What is Enlightenment essay. This has to appear rather deflated next to Kant, who went as far as to assert that unless human history as a whole could progress, every human life would be revealed as meaningless. Foucault's local practices seem tiny in comparison to the stakes of the project of maturity. And Foucault himself recognizes this. Firstly, he continually states he prefers these small-scale actions, as if politics were equivalent to the freedom of the buyer. Secondly, Foucault poses the question, do we not run the risk of letting ourselves be determined by more general structures of which we may not be conscious and over which we may have no control? and though he parries with some remarks about the general implications of the local, the question is too honest for the answers. Notice that the opposition is either local practices that expand the range of freedoms, the set of actions available to the individual, or an impossible whole that cannot be addressed except with despair. The specter of pseudo-action remains. Might these local forms be a form of resignation to the status quo? Foucault asserts that his method's strength is that it links up with current forms of practice, that it makes them intelligible in their newness. But it is not clear that theory's adaptation to current practice, an adaptation Foucault also, at the same time, had to persistently deny, as he critiqued phenomena like the gay rights movement, ought to be the index of its importance. The Frankfurt School recognized their time, and a fortiori ours, as a time where the distance between the problems and the practices capable of transforming them appeared ever greater. But thought takes on the character of renunciation if it refuses to admit domination because the practice to overcome it is not immediately available. And why assume that simply because we are currently unconscious and lack control over various large-scale determinative structures, say capital, this must always be the case? What is not clear is if a sort of additive process of local struggles with power in its manifold forms will ever get you to the possibility of consciousness and control over the whole that determines its parts. The whole about which Adorno pointedly remarked, inverting Hegel, the whole is the false. But the essence of dialectics is that the false is itself real. The return to Kant also does not encourage Foucault to rethink his conception of power in light of his new insights. We know the basics: power is created and makes subjects into what they are, etc. Foucault's realization that he had not escaped the Enlightenment, that this was a wrong-headed way of thinking about the problem, allows him to perhaps admit what was always there, that for all his purported radicalism, he only represented a liberal in sheep's clothing. In his much inferior essay, What is Critique?, Foucault puts forward a definition that will pop up frequently in the later writings, that critique consists of wanting not to be governed so much. This resistance to the governmentalization of reality, the profusion of forms of individualizing guidance systems that shape our most intimate selves, can take two forms over the course of Foucault's thought. The first is a sort of worship of spontaneity, where Foucault condemns the attempt to form aims and plans in political action as a sort of internal colonization of the subject by power. This form apotheosized with Foucault's support of the Iranian Revolution, whose horrific conclusion, not only the Iranian Revolution, the most reactionary elements of it, whose horrific conclusion no doubt influenced his later return to Kant. The second form is a renewed interest in liberalism as the authentic tradition proclaiming the limits of the ability to be governed. Indeed, at the same time as he was writing his celebratory articles on Iran, he was recommending that his students read von Mises and Hayek to think about the resistance to being governed. The microphysics of power reveals its liberal core. But we cannot, all the attempts of analytic philosophy aside, attempt to return to the innocence of liberalism, to imagine that government is the central problem and that if we sweep away government, all will be well. The persistence of necessity in modern society, the contradictory character of modernity as both the possibility of freedom and the ever-regressive reduction of the struggle for survival and self-preservation, is how Adorno and Horkheimer characterized life under a capitalism unredeemed, where Engels' leap to the kingdom of freedom was instead a stumble into a trench or a pit of corpses. This necessity means that social integration is necessary, and that pathological forms of integration, like repression and psychoanalysis, should be recognized as recourses for psychic survival under certain conditions. Foucault might claim that capitalism, too, is a form of government, but is two poles of either naturalizing being governed, there will always be power, or of ending up talking about government as the many-sided tentacles of the state, and thus allowing a liberal conclusion, do not leave much room for thinking about the dynamics that lead to governmentalization, or how the trend of history might be reversed. For all his genealogy, or overcome. For all his genealogy, Foucault ends up being unable to think historically, and thus his late ethical studies are trumped by Adorno's simple maxim, wrong life cannot be lived rightly. I'm wrapping up here. If we are to take seriously Foucault's admission that his detours may have been amenable to rectification, if we recognize him as a key, perhaps still the key critic of modernity of the last philosophical and political generation after Adorno's death in '69, we need to realize that Foucault as a critical theorist is torn, like the reality he confronted, with the struggle for freedom and renunciation before the status quo. What Foucault cannot understand in those he critiques, say the pathos of Jeremy Bentham, who imagines the total reconstruction of the social world for human ends, but who offers only a nightmare vision of that age of enlightenment, we need to find in Foucault. For without determinately reflecting on the persistence of necessity and the possibility of freedom in modernity, Foucault is forced into first a nihilist repudiation of the possibility of scientifically advancing the human condition, and later into an abstract opposition to the present order, combining direct action and liberalism in a heady brew. It is capitalism's dialectical character, maintaining on freedom and creating the conditions for the possibility of freedom, that neither Foucault's earlier critique nor even his return to Kant can take into account. In the force field of Foucault's thought, as he tries to remain radical and critical in the name of an unimpeachable status quo, in the face of an unimpeachable status quo, as he lauds the local while always expressing the terror of and thus the necessity to overcome the total, in all this, Marxism, as most acutely posing the problem of enlightenment, is absent. Very end, promise. If we, cultural studies intellectuals, our Weltanschauung, are to overcome Foucault in his own name, instead of rifling around for fun terms or justifications of one's research interests as constituting new subjectivity effects or some such, we should confront the grandiose scope and the aporia of his thought, which I can say in one phrase, the political project of Marxism. This is Foucault's greatest detour, one he never overcame. As we inherit him, it is incumbent upon us to make him what he was, to pose the question where he faltered. We see freedom through Foucault as through a glass darkly.
My paper is called The Obsolescence of Walter Benjamin. There's a study that seeks to use Benjamin to argue that the anthropology of Haitian Pentecostalism should abstain from imposition of scholarly categories and instead resonate with the original sacred meanings. There's a study that uses or seeks to use Walter Benjamin to outline a theory of critical pedestrianism. There's a study that claims that Benjamin, the Benjamin of the work of art essay, helps us see Dada and photography as part of the rediscovery of, quote, the authenticity of experience and memory. These are the typical Benjamins of contemporary academic practice. Along with Deleuze, Foucault, Bourdieu, Habermas, Rancière, Badiou, Butler, Zizek, Benjamin has become a chief manufacturer of theory to be pasted ruthlessly upon any cultural object. We know, or think we know, what it might mean to give a Benjaminian reading. Benjamin, writing in his One-Way Street in 1928, writes, "The notion of the class war can be misleading. It does not refer to a trial of strength to decide the question, who shall win, who shall be defeated, or to a struggle whose outcome is good for the victor and bad for the vanquished. To think in this way is to romanticize and obscure the facts. For whether the bourgeoisie wins or loses the fight, it remains doomed by the inner contradictions that in the course of its development will become deadly. The only question is whether the downfall will come through itself or through the proletariat. The continuance or the end of 3,000 years of cultural development will be decided by the answer. History knows nothing of the evil infinity contained in the image of the two wrestlers locked in eternal combat. The true politician reckons only in dates. And if the abolition of the bourgeoisie is not completed by an almost calculable moment in economic and technical development, a moment signaled by inflation and poison gas warfare, all is lost. Before the spark reaches the dynamite, the lighted fuse must be cut." Benjamin himself was immolated in the explosion, and the debris from the shock, still moving outwards, has overcome, or nearly overcome, his own work. The dead Benjamin, to use his own phrase, has already been murdered, transformed into his own opposite. He has become what Adorno feared he would be, the purveyor of wide-eyed presentation of mere facticity, a theoretical crutch to the seemingly endless scholarly recycling of cultural objects as they pass in and out of cultural studies journal for their, quote, analysis. In an unrecognized irony, Benjamin has been put into service of a mode of historical consciousness, or, to be specific, unconsciousness, that he would ruthlessly criticize from his earliest writings until his last work. Here is how he explained this in 1914. There is a view of history that puts its faith in the infinite extent of time and thus concerns itself only with the speed, or lack of it, with which people and epochs advance along the path of progress. This corresponds to a certain absence of coherence and rigor in the demands it makes upon the present. In 1940, he would call this form of consciousness, identified with the practice of German social democracy, historicism. He would describe it as the concept of progression through homogeneous, empty time. To demonstrate this, he quotes, Dietz again, every day our cause becomes clearer and people get smarter. Against these images of homogeneous time, Benjamin offered images of catastrophe, wreckage, ruin, and explosion, the historical continuum bursting open. But what is easily misleading, and often is misled, that these accounts of time as catastrophe, as breakdown, as the spark of hope in the past, they did not emerge because of a romantic disposition or predilection for catastrophic images, but out of Benjamin's project to recognize and critique his own age, to achieve historical consciousness. Without this critical project, Benjamin becomes aestheticized, transformed into a postmodernist avant lettre, a sort of proto-Derrida concerned with and advocating for the impossibility of stable meaning, the self-destruction of the subject, and various types of deconstruction. But even when its object seemed obscure, he wrote about children's books, he wrote about science fiction novels, he wrote commentaries on poems by Brecht, he wrote about problems in the sociology of language, he offered recollections of Nice, Naples, and Moscow. Benjamin's effort was to recognize and to critique the present. This must be kept in mind when Benjamin is to be read, that all of his work, however obscure its presentation, seeks this self-recognition, to offer, in the words of Marx, that Benjamin would include an essential place in the arcade project, that it will then become evident that the world has long dreamed of possessing something by which it only has to be conscious of in order to possess it in reality. It will become evident that it is not a question of drawing a great mental divide between past and future, but of realizing the thoughts of the past. Lastly, it will become evident that mankind is not beginning a new work, but is consciously carrying into effect its old work. It was this program of the critique of the opaque dreams of humanity as they manifested itself in the present that drove Benjamin to attend to the discarded, seemingly useless forms of modern life. Half-abandoned urban spaces in Paris, an almost forgotten novel by Goethe, fashion, obscure philosophical claims, the experience of hashish. While people take the peripatetic research interest as a sign of his eclecticism, his methodological pluralism, they indicate exactly the opposite, a unitary approach, desirous of demonstrating what Benjamin called the endangered, excoriating, and ridiculed ideas and products of the creative mind, that these ideas, these forms, participate too in the unrecognized dream. I'd like to read you something from the introduction of the announcement to Benjamin's never-published journal, Angelus Novus. The vocation of a journal is to proclaim the spirit of its age. Relevance to the present is more important even than the unity or clarity, and a journal would be doomed, like the newspapers, to insubstantiality if it did not give voice to vitality enough, powerful enough to salvage its even most dubious components by validating them. The universal validity of spiritual utterances must be bound up with a question of whether they can lay claim to a place within future religious orders. Not as if such orders were already visible on the horizon. What is visible is the fact that without them, none of the things that are struggling for life can make their appearance and mark these days as the first of a new epoch. What this perhaps obscure passage points to is the reason why Benjamin's critical project looks so different than Marx, Hegel's, or Kant, and what makes for the distinguishing and perhaps confusing form of critical theory. For Benjamin and his peers, a new world seemed on the horizon, whether it would be the dawn of a genuine humanity or the emergence of an unforeseeable catastrophe. As Benjamin's comrade Rosa Luxemburg put it, socialism or barbarism. The fate of 3,000 years of culture would be decided, and it was. Benjamin, from the beginning of his writing, recognized his own moment as shot through with the intensity and pathos of transition. The future seemed to be shining brightly through the present, illuminating it. During his first conscious decade, the potential seemed to reside within the youth movement, the independent student youth movement, but with its betrayal and collapse into catastrophe, Benjamin's mentor Wyneken supported the World War, and as a result, Benjamin's closest friend committed suicide. It was a trauma that would haunt him his entire life. Benjamin sought it instead in the objects of bourgeois life, children's books, speculative philosophy, Kabbalistic doctrine. It was his project to disclose the imminent state of perfection in these objects, to show how they too seem to shake with possibility and the sense of catastrophe. Thus, when Benjamin came across Marxism, or when Marxism became an issue for him, it was a specific moment. In 1924, he traveled to Capri to work on his habilitation document, and he met a sort of Latvian Marxist named Oskar Laschis, read Lukács's History and Class Consciousness, talked with Ernst Bloch. It was not a matter of transforming his research, but of confirming what he had already embarked upon. He writes in a letter to Gershom Scholem that History and Class Consciousness astonish me because these principles resonate for me or validate my own thinking. What we call critical theory today emerges from the collision of the prior messianic mode of critique. This is sort of his early writings, the post-1924 writings, with a recognition of the possibility, fraught but present, of revolutionary Marxism overcoming capital. It is the tension between philosophical, cultural, aesthetic, theological criticism and revolutionary Marxism that constitutes what has now become known as critical theory. Benjamin writes that regarding communism, the problem with theory and practice seems to be, in effect, that given the disparity must be preserved between the two realms, any definitive insight into theory is precisely dependent on practice. The tension, this is the tension again between sort of cultural, theological, philosophical criticism and revolutionary Marxism, has sort of kept critical theory alive in the present. It has also aided in the complete absorption of critical theory into a conservative, even reactionary, even barbarous mode of contemporary humanistic research. In his essay on elective affinities, Benjamin suggests that at the beginning of a work's existence, its truth content, by which he means the project, purpose, and mission of the work, and its material content, the specifics of its endeavor, coincide. For Benjamin, as he wrote, the material objects of his critique and the aim of the critique, the historical consciousness of bourgeois society, converge. But, Benjamin argues, as the work ages, as it decays, the two separate. We have a Benjamin today without any truth content, a Benjamin who has become indissociable from his objects, Benjamin as one of the strange quasi-natural objects of bourgeois society. For critique, or Benjamin argues, seeks to recover or grasp the truth of the work, even if this truth has become opaque and separated from the object itself. He writes, in this sense, the history of works prepares for their critique, and thus historical distance increases their power. If, to use a simile, one views the growing work as a burning funeral pyre, then the commentator stands before it like a chemist, and the critic like an alchemist. Whereas for the former, wood and ash remain the sole objects of his analysis. For the later, only the flame preserves itself as an enigma, that of what is alive. Thus the critic inquires into the truth, whose living flame continues to burn over the heavy logs of what is past and the light ashes of what has been experienced. While Benjamin burns brighter and more intensely than ever before, we are uncertain, necessarily so, about the truth of his living flame, about why a melancholiac and obscure German critic continues to matter for us so long after his unnecessary death.
So I'd now like to give the panelists 3 minutes to respond to each other's work, and we'll open up for questions. So let's just go down the line. Let's keep remarks to 3 minutes.
Well, in keeping with the idea of critical theory against the grain, and speaking maybe to Marcus and Jeremy's presentations with respect to liberalism and enlightenment, Kant, etc., I wanted to sort of pose the question of this antinomy that I think came up in both presentations of the individual and society, and the conventional understanding that the right, the political right, values sort of individual liberty and autonomy, whereas the left values the collective and the social in that sense. And I just want to sort of pose the phrase from Marx, from the Communist Manifesto, from Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, that the society that they were after was a society in which the needs of each would be the presupposition for the needs of the whole, right? In other words, a sort of reversal of a kind of commonplace understanding of socialism that goes little remarked, and yet, now in a sort of post-20th century way, like Marcus, you invoked the Tea Party. this question of, said, I wouldn't want to live in a world of their rights. I would say, in a sense, why not? Right? Taxed enough already, right? Why not? And also, isn't the problem that they have, not that they assert the individual's rights, but rather that they have an incoherent sense of what that might mean. In other words, that they have a kind of incoherent, that they're sort of self-contradictory in their kind of vision. Because I think that this kind of comes around to something that Jeremy was raising about the kind of affinity, which I'm glad was avowed, right, of Foucault with the kind of von Mises, Hayek, kind of attenuated kind of classical liberalism in the 20th century, the kind of recoil against the sort of state form of capitalism in the 20th century. It's great that he told his students that they should read von Mises and Hayek because it sort of squares the circle, right, or draws the connection that otherwise one would just want to sort of kind of infer from Foucault that he does have a kind of conservative response to modernity. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Thanks to you guys.
Should we answer? Should we try and answer?
Well, just David's remarks in response to the other presentations.
I think you've answered a lot of your own questions. And I agree with you on the incoherence of the Tea Party. What I think the investigation of liberalism offers us is the possibility to rethink the fundamental structures of the society in which we live. We've got this sort of whole kind of construct about rights, and the way they flip-flop around seems to me to be fairly unhelpful to the politics of genuine social justice resource allocation, which is what I'm interested in. And I think that if we're going to get anywhere with the discussion about these kinds of questions, which is the serious questions about critical theory, which Ben has raised in a very beautiful way about the kind of discounting of critique, if you don't mind me saying that. The discounting of Walter Benjamin. Isn't it interesting that not one of us in our presentations mentioned Nazism? You mentioned fascism. This is something of which I have great difficulty talking. But this is we're not too far from this. We're not too far from this. And I think that the name that we cannot talk about in these presentations is still terrifying. Only today or this morning or yesterday, CNN was playing without any hint of either irony or disgust a bunch of images from a church, a Muslim mosque that had been torched in Tennessee, which had been decorated with white power and Nazi insignias, and they just shot. They're just a symbol, just there. While they're interviewing behind the guy that they were interviewing, who was the senior Muslim person from the mosque, not the imam, but somebody else. And I think these things are important. I think we've got to work out how to talk about them. I think we've got to work out how to understand that the spaces that we create through a rights-based discourse in our societies, in the liberal democratic West, are spaces where we should be experiencing a sense of despair and a sense of horror, which Benjamin so rightly recognised. I particularly liked your turn of phrase, Jeremy, where you talked about, you used this sentence, the question is too honest for the answers. And I think if we go with, and I agree with your analysis of Foucault, and if people haven't looked at the discussion or the debate between Foucault and Chomsky on YouTube, it's worth having a look at the way they dance around each other. I think the time for dancing is over.
I'll finish sort of like Adorno's comment about Schoenberg and Tin Pan Alley, or two products of the same culture. Foucault and
That's
Chomsky.
right, that's
I'm not
right.
sure which is which. But I wanted to actually pose a similar question to Marcus's presentation that Chris poses. I was thinking of a different Marx quote, but there's this interesting, Marx talks about that, in fact, sort of the character of all human history up to the present, the character of prehistory, has in fact been the eternal sacrifice of the individual to the collective. And in fact, bourgeois society is the apotheosis of the sacrifice of the individual to the collective, insofar as the individual continues to find him or herself alienated from the forces that he or she created. And so the social reality, the demand to labor, etc., itself poses abstract compulsions on any individual's self-determination. So sort of contra to the usual, again, perception of like what freedom would mean, Marx is actually like freedom, the individual would have the ability to determine his or her own destiny for the first time after capitalism, not like the collective would take control. That would just be like the apotheosis of pre-modern society. And then in regards to both Ben and Chris's, I feel like there's sort of in some ways they both touch on either side of this issue, which is how in some ways critical theory itself becomes a form of renunciation, becomes a form of adjustment to the status quo. And I feel like, Chris, in some ways, with you, it's the question of like critical theory's relationship to the object in sort of the present day. That sort of like, what we have is kind of, in your theory section of the paper, you quote 8,000, people who were critical in various ways, and then in your practical section of your paper, you find some object that you can kind of slam in there into some person's order of thinking. And then, with Ben, on the other side, it's the relationship of that sort of objectivity and that way of thinking to the complete lack of political possibility, to the kind of perpetuation, the perpetual barbarism in which we live. So I wonder, sort of like, critical theory itself as a mode of self-repression, of pleasure and renunciation, is something I think both of you could speak to.
I'd like to, in response to Jeremy's paper, raise the possibility that Foucault was right and adequate in his political evaluation. That actually it is sort of in response to you, Marcus, that it is a time for dancing, and that to attempt anything more than dancing risks inflicting upon humanity a barbarism. Basically, I think what Foucault can make us aware of is the degree to which emancipation, and this is where we could bring to Nazism, that the left called into effect the greatest catastrophe in human history, that in its both failure to stop Nazism, but also its provocation of Nazism is responsible for catastrophe. And that what Foucault recognized after the Second World War was that we had sort of entered into a moment of like almost subjectless fascism, or fascism without fascists, and that the reason he crafted his politics as he did was sort of in effect a rescue operation to preserve whatever last pitiful remains of autonomy preserved. So if you read Foucault's last writings on the care of self, where he suggests that practices of S&M or friendship between men have political promise, it's because he recognizes that there's nothing else. And I think we need to confront the fact that he was probably right.
All right. Well, we have for the audience. So
Ask a question?
Yes, in the back.
I have a question on the Foucault paper. Clearly you think Foucault is hostile to Marxism, but you didn't say anything about his relationship to Louis Althusser, who was his colleague at the École Normale Supérieure, and who I think sort of voiced the sort of similar criticisms that he voiced of Hegelian Marxism, mainly that the totality was not a viable notion, and that the notion of the science needed to be qualified by its relationship to ideology. And one can also pick up on Althusser's notion of interpolation, as developed by Foucault's notion of technology or subjectivation. So I just want to ask you if you considered that, or am I bringing things up?
The question is relationship between Foucault and
There's really
Althusser.
a great deal about how he did Marxism.
My claim was not exactly that Foucault was anti-Marxist, because biographically, you can look, and Foucault even says in a later interview, like, Marx is really important to me, I just didn't footnote him because I wanted to fuck over the French academics who all thought we have to footnote Marx constantly, or whatever. I think in some ways, Foucault's anti-Marxist in the same way that Althusser is anti-Marxist, ultimately, which is that it becomes a sort of a naturalization of the degeneration of Marxist thought. So in Althusser, the absolutization of the structural determination of individuals by their place within the system is not, as in Adorno and Horkheimer, used as a critical category to point to the impossibilities of the present, but is instead made to be a metaphysical principle of all existence as such. So in Althusser's Marxism, I think, ultimately, and the reason that Foucault both appropriates it in the sense that Althusser's sort of like picture of the ultimate inhumanity, of the ultimate sort of cold universe that answers not back at us, resonates, but at the same time, the Marxism part is just useless at that point. Like, if you really buy Althusser, then you can't be a Marxist. And I think Foucault recognized that most acutely than anyone.
Very rigid sense of Marxism.
I don't think it's rigid. I think it's actually attentive to what Marxism is a project of revolutionary transformation and not like a methodology for post-war humanistic research. So in that case, it is rigid. I mean, whether you agree with it or not, but it is rigid.
I would say Marxisms and critical theories.
Yeah, I want to say something about Althusser and Foucault. It's a kind of a roundabout route in terms of genealogy. And this might sound a little bit tendentious, but nevertheless, which is that Althusser kind of comes to a kind of anti-Hegelianism via Lacan, and Lacan, in a sense, is inspired by Heidegger, and so there's sort of the deep kind of Nietzschean background going on, and I would say that it's a misreading of Nietzsche, meaning the idea that. You see it in an essay by Foucault called Nietzsche, Genealogy, History, where he basically gives you Nietzsche without freedom, Nietzsche without transformation, in favor of the idea that history needs to be attended to in its sort of cracks and fissures and contingencies, in the way that Althusser thought that the Russian or Chinese revolutions were against the logic of history and were contingent over determined events, that whole concept of overdetermination from Lacan. They were the sort of eruption of what can't be repressed by the kind of logic of history, in the same way that Lacan has a sort of misreading of Freud with respect to the conscious and unconscious mind. That somehow the conscious mind is a kind of a constraint on the kind of percolating unconscious, sort of, unresolvable, sort of life history kind of constantly bubbling forth. And so, the relationship, I would say that in large measure what Jeremy was saying about Foucault, one could also say about Althusser. There's a sort of an antinomy there. In other words, is it the Althusser of contradiction and overdetermination, or the Althusser of ideological state apparatuses? In other words, is the argument for contingency or the argument of the full sort of inscription of power? And in a sense, they're two sides of the same coin. That's a conception. And what's missing, and this is why you get the kind of Badiou kind of moment, the kind of Alain Badiou moment today, where emancipation is understood as an event, right, as a sort of a contingent event, rather than, there's a kind of consistent anti-Hegelianism there that pretty much turns the whole question of freedom into a matter of contingency, rupture, a kind of event, rather than a process of transformation.
Yes, in the back.
I have a question, a couple questions. For Jeremy, this dichotomy or tension between, or this kind of choice between Adorno's pseudo-activity that you see in Foucault as well versus this kind of local action or micro-action resistance. How do you see hegemony or hegemonic strategies play into this? Because it seems like It's either you can't reverse the totality of everything, or you resist. And when you try to do that, if you try to create a political project to challenge the status quo, then you're just, reinforcing relations of domination. But that makes it sound as if, let's say, the differences between the New Deal order and neoliberalism are inconsequential. That the hegemonic strategies put forth in the 1930s by the Popular Front and the New Deal coalition, that didn't have any consequences. I'm not saying this is what you're arguing, but this is a problem, and also with Benjamin's statements that he's made, that anytime you try to create a political project, a hegemonic project, that you're doomed to more catastrophe. That makes it sound as if those battles, or even just taking American history as a whole, the Populist Party, the Knights of Labor, the FL-CIO, that none of these projects to redefine rights or redefine who the political economic subject is don't matter. And to me, what I see with the Tea Party is that they're engaging in a hegemonic project to redefine who the political subject of this moment is. And to me, there's deep consequences to that. And it's also problematic to say if the left doesn't engage in a counter-hegemonic project, because it's just doomed to fail no matter what they do, I think is problematic. So that's my spiel. And that kind of relates to, is it Marcus? I didn't hear your name at the very beginning. My question to you is I agree, again, that it is problematic not to weigh in on a definition of what is welfare, what is for the common good, and this refusal to do so is problematic to me. But the question is, do you think it is practical to engage in a hegemonic strategy that says, individual rights, we can dismantle that, or we can attempt to engage in selective tradition to come up with communal conception of rights? Or can you work within the individual, the kind of hegemony of individual rights? Anyways, I'll leave it at that.
Well, I guess there are three, all three of you on the end can respond to Marcus with respect to the communitarian problem versus individual rights. Jeremy with respect to the specter of failure in politics that Foucault is suggesting. And Ben, perhaps you can clarify your point about the left kind of inviting catastrophe, which was raised.
I think communitarian rights or collective rights are going to become much more clearly delineated and defined as the actions of the right become more successful. The kinds of actions taking place not only against organised labour, which are kind of symbolic of communitarian interests, but against the basic kind of everyday concerns of human beings. I don't watch cable or regular television. I just watch movies, but Netflix. And one of the reasons I don't is because I cannot stand to be abused by advertising, even though I teach a course in advertising. And for example, yesterday I saw, so the kind of total dismemberment of the kind of economic achievements that came from the New Deal, that came from the Great Society movement, that came from caring for the elderly or caring for people who were disabled. For example, in my neighbourhood, we just removed all the funding for disabled support for children in public schools. It's fucking outrageous. And so these are becoming more and more obvious. These procedures seem to me to be becoming more and more obvious to highlight the fact that we are going to take the fucking weak, we're going to fucking take the disabled, we're going to take every fucking poor bastard and we're going to throw them out onto the fucking scrap heap because we believe that privacy and the individual is preeminent. Now, hegemonic, of course it's hegemonic. And the only way to rethink that is to rethink how the reinvention of something like welfare or the reinvention of something like communitarianism or the reinvention of something like the public interest can actually become a project. I do public policy around communications. You can't have a conversation, a meaningful conversation with anybody in Washington DC, in the FCC or around that area about what drives our communication policy. It's called the public interest. It's completely evacuated of any kind of meaningful discursive value these days. And these kinds of strategies and ideas have been going on for years, to completely remove the possibility of having a conversation about communal or shared interests. Everything is driven down to the individual level. So, you know, I clearly have strong feelings about this. I've had I'm an outsider, as it were. I'm an American citizen now, but I see this very clearly compared to other structures which are more socially embedded in, for example, my country in Australia and in Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. And we need to think. We need to think creatively and quite productively as soon as we can about these things and do something about it, because they're well underway. And anyway, that's all I want to say.
I mean, regarding whether the hegemonic strategies of the Communist Party Popular Front period had an effect, I do think they had an incredible effect. They prevented any chance of revolution in the United States of America, and in part bear responsibility for every bit of the horrors that the U.S. has inflicted upon the world. And so I think that the danger, the attempt of an Adorno and Horkheimer, and I think really mostly of Foucault, is to take very seriously the claim socialism or barbarism, and then to say that the very worst thing you can do in a moment of barbarism is hold out the false hope that some small-scale individual project is itself going to magically transform into total revolution. That's not to say necessarily that means total immobility before the whole. Like, I think for Adorno and Horkheimer, the possibility of politics is the only reason it's worth writing a book at all. Like, otherwise, why bother writing a book? But that possibility of politics is actively militated against by the continual adjustment of people to an ever worse status quo, and the continual way they pursue their decisions are ways of satisfying themselves, not actually changing the situation. And I think that, the policy of the Communist Party, whatever, you can talk about the many mediations through which that happened in the US, but I think is a great example of that.
I want to say a little bit about where Benjamin, why he's so interested in this idea of catastrophe. One of the places where it comes from, although not the only one, is a remark that Lukács makes in, I think, the essay on reification in History and Class Consciousness. And what he says there is that as revolutionary politics approach their goal, the risk of catastrophe gets ever brighter and brighter. So what Benjamin is pointing out is actually, it is at once the danger and the possibility of these politics. I actually don't think, I think to believe, this is perhaps a critique of what you were saying in terms of fascism, that to believe that fascism, the way fascism will come, or it's sort of incipient, or will come through booted thugs, is actually to sort of miss the distinctive character of the present, which is that we have, the phrase I used before was a fascism without fascists, but it's sort of like the eternal reproduction and worsening and diminishing of political possibility, so that actually catastrophe in some sense the hope for catastrophe would be optimistic. Like what we have is actually, to some extent, and this is very upsetting to say, we're already living in something post-catastrophic. The image that just keeps haunting me, and it came up because of the crisis in Japan, is the last of Kurosawa's, which is the last film we made, called Dreams. And the last part of Dreams is basically Japan, Dream Japan imagined as a land filled with radioactive fog where humans wander around lost, confronted constantly by monsters whose constitution or nature they're not sure of. I think that's probably the most adequate way to describe the present.
The gentleman in a very fine sweater.
Embarrassing complimenting me. I actually wanted to kind of maybe pick up on your call to seriously rethink and reconsider and define rights, and to do so, in fact, maybe in a somewhat seemingly counterintuitive move, which is to go all the way back to the late 19th century and to look at the way Marx leveled a critique at the founding document of the Socialist Party, the critique of the Gotha program, in which he raises the problem with Lassalle, the student who is the kind of preeminent socialist in Germany at the time, whose theory and writing is very deeply influential on the founding document. And he essentially says, there's all this talk of equal right, right? That in a sense, like the way this was talked about was in terms of workers gaining their full value of their product of their labor, that they should all equally have access to their full value of their labor. And Marx says, well, this is, in a sense, kind of sheer utopianism doesn't make any sense of the fact that we need to continue to have a social fund to do things with society. But the more kind of profound point that he makes is regarding rights themselves. The notion of equal rights is itself being an injustice on the individual, right? So there's a way in which the notion of individual rights that somebody like the Tea Party in a kind of unconscious way raises is in fact deeply bound up with a kind of collectivist imagination of society in which the individual is, despite their individuality, equated with other individuals. So all individuals have an equal basis to lay claim to society's product, right? And so I think that Marx is kind of posing the question of, well, how would one overcome this situation in which the best that can be hoped for is for individuality to be undermined in the project of actually ensuring equality socially, right? How would you actually realize the particularity of an individual outside of that kind of social basis, right? And this is really the kind of, and it's interesting because it came to me actually through reading Lenin and State and Revolution, which this is kind of the main point that Lenin is posing about the post-revolutionary state, the question of what it would mean for it to wither away. And I think that we have this imagination of liberalism as individuals and socialism as collectivity, right? But in fact, that's a deep reversal in a sense of the more profound thinking and criticism of the socialists themselves, which saw liberalism as fundamentally based on a collectivist notion of the individual, and socialism as a project of attempting to actually realize, in fact, individuality and particularity. So I'm wondering if maybe you could respond to that kind of dilemma or that problem.
Well, you put it very nicely, and it's a wonderful dilemma. I think it's a wonderful dilemma, and I think it's what we should spend a lot more time directing our energy towards, for the sorts of reasons that you've described and the sorts of reasons that many other people have described, including Lenin, who clearly saw it as a major issue, right? One of the first things that Lenin did was to introduce the rights to letters to the editor. Right? Simple enough statement. The second thing was, what were the Soviets? The Soviets were in fact governments or parliaments from the otherwise dominated, completely overwhelmed regions of what became the Soviet Union or Russia, where they were given autonomy to manage their individual cultures within the Soviet. Now, that soon fell apart, within the total Soviet, that soon fell apart soon enough, but there was a very clear effort on the part of the kind of Bolshevik group to try and organise and orchestrate this relationship, right, between what are your interests as a Kazakh, let's say, and the culture and the interests of you as a person within that culture, and then within the greater whole. We don't talk much about those kinds of models. I mean, in the United States, the whole thing, lots of conversations we're not supposed to have, apparently. Right? And we should spend a lot more time understanding this history and talking about it and thinking about it, both within our own philosophical and progressive causes and within our progressive commitment to trying to understand the relationship between the individual and the collective. I'm putting it up as a major issue. The bourgeois revolution, which Engels critiqued, after the Paris Commune, was, of course, the manifestation of this complete denial of some of the collective claims that were made within that revolutionary moment. Right? So you go and read those extracts about what Engels was saying about the rise of the bourgeois revolution. We're going to crush, right? We're going to crush the opportunity for individuals to recognise themselves and their rights, because we're going to have a bourgeois state that's going to make sure that everything is organised according to the rules and regulations of bourgeoisie. There's fascinating stuff that we need to think more about. I'm just throwing these out there because there is no solution to this, but it must be part of our discussion about a deeper attempt to understand and act on these kinds of things, because we do have to take action. Where it sits in the scheme of things in terms of either revolutionary destruction or some other thing, I don't know, but it's important.
Well, in order to conclude, let's have all the final questions very briefly. Then let's go down the line and have final responses. So.
Sure. I guess something that I was thinking about with respect to the other question that was asked earlier about sort of like the kind of like sort of New Deal kind of configuration, and later sort of neoliberalism, and that one of the things that seems to be very interesting about neoliberalism is that it's not simply a kind of it's not simply like sort of the kind of problem of liberalism being kind of reposed or something, because in a sense that would almost be that would have been a lot better, I think, historically. So like history would have been like treading water, maybe. But that didn't actually happen. I mean, because one of the things that's actually very notable now, sort of like looking back to figures like Cohen and also like Adam Smith, is that there wasn't a conflation between sort of civil society and the market and sort of like individual. These things were kind of like held in tension in a certain way, and it was thought that the sort of expansion of individual rights would sort of add up to a kind of social freedom. There was a sort of optimism with respect to that project, but they weren't seen as being like identical. And there was a sense in which it would be part of a like political project. You would have to actually through civil society achieve limits to monopoly, etc. That these would have to be political victories that have to be put in place in order for liberalism as a project to like survive. What's interesting is that like that whole consciousness of liberalism in its early moment is completely lost with the like resurrection of neoliberalism. That in a sense it's like there's not an idea that like individual freedom and like the free market might have some relation to each other that could be like that could bear fruits politically. They're just seen as being identical. And that conflation is really the way in which sort of like neoliberalism falls completely below the sort of like earlier sort of bourgeois radical liberal moment. And that's why it's what gives it such a peculiar character, which I would like everyone to comment. I would like to hear other people's thoughts on this. What gives it such a peculiar character that like in the name of liberalism, because it is like in this sort of bizarre, convoluted the name of liberalism, that all of these projects that had been initiated in the name of liberalism earlier are being dismantled actually.
Okay. Any other questions or comments from the audience? All right. Well, by way of response, let's have very quick, less than 2 minutes, final remarks from our panelists.
I kind of wanted to, building off how the discussion developed, like return to the question about, in a sense, the left bearing responsibility for forms of capitalism, the development of capitalism. And, Jeremy did a good job of raising the question of neoliberalism having affinities with Foucault in certain respects, and postmodernism and neoliberalism kind of sharing a moment, the disenchantment of the welfare state. But the welfare state not simply to be understood as like an unalloyed good, but rather as a kind of problematic, kind of authoritarian and repressive kind of solution to the problems of capitalism that had come before. The Frankfurt School, who's been invoked here, had this notion of the kind of three faces of the crisis of the 20th century, namely Nazism, Stalinism, and sort of New Dealism, as all being sort of conservative responses or kind of reactionary, more or less conservative, more or less reactionary responses to the crisis of the 20th century. So what we're dealing with, and I think Marx has been invoked a few times, what we're dealing with is a sort of accumulated problem, namely that there was a failure to deal with the problems of 19th century capitalism. There was then, that failure took the form of a kind of state capitalism in the 20th century that the left more or less unconsciously helped bring about, whether through the Soviet Union or et cetera, or the New Deal, the Popular Front. And then there was a problem of that form of capitalism that was itself not overcome, but rather compounded with a kind of postmodernism, neoliberalism, kind of new left, generally, kind of if we have Foucault stand in as a cipher for the new left. So what we're dealing with is sort of accumulated, unresolved problems that have kind of compounded themselves historically. So that we have the compounded problems of 19th century capitalism, state capitalism in the 20th century, and postmodern capitalism. And it's a lot of, talk about the mounting catastrophe, it's a lot of sort of wreckage that we're sort of suffocating under. But that's the way that I would characterize it. as a sort of accumulated failures of the left or accumulated failed forms of discontent with capital that we're kind of left dealing with today.
Okay, so that reminds me of the comment that Zizek made that we need to remember that we are the recipients of a fantastic set of successes. Remember that essay about Leninism?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he says what we've got now is unbe-fucking-lievable. I'll leave you with an Australianism. Unbe-fucking-lievable, right? When we stop working, we get paid. We get a retirement. We have public health. We have roads that are sealed for us. We have a tax system that generally kind of works and doesn't work. The fact that we're sitting here, you know, in relative freedom. The fact that we're all reasonably healthy. The fact that my children are all still well alive and haven't died of totally preventable diseases. So I could sit up here and say we've come a long way, baby. Right? And we have. So I don't know. We got to work this. We got to work this out. And liberalism will tell us, just to go back to your comment, liberalism will tell us, shut the fuck up because look what you've got. In a sense, you should be happy with it. And if you look at all the documents, pretty well all documents coming out of neoliberal camp, they'll say that what we're doing is giving all those great things to everybody else in the world. And my point, of course, to go back to the pessimistic side of my persona, is that it's impossible. And we know, empirically, it's impossible for everybody on this fucking planet to live like we do as liberals. Right? It's not sustainable. It cannot be done. So how are we going to resolve that issue in a collective sense? Or are we just going to allow it to be resolved in some kind of way where we really very quickly get to the worst of the dog-eat-dog situation, where only the strong survive, where we get to a kind of liberalism which embodies Darwinian excesses, and I don't think it's very far away from us.
I mean, I would just respond a little bit to that again with the sort of dialectical inversion, which is the dialectic of enlightenment claim that we already live in a society deeply characterized by asceticism, renunciation, where every possible hope for fulfillment we constantly are keeping ourselves from achieving. And so I'm worried about a politics of renunciation, a politics that proclaims that what's needed is for us to give up so that all might live. In some sense, the giving up is what we're always doing. Insofar as we're all fat, that's the greatest sign that we've given up. Not that we are, not that we're engorging ourselves. The one other thing I wanted to pose about Foucault, and again, I like this sort of thing that Foucault's sort of career really skyrocketed after '68, and '68 is right when Adorno dies. So there's this nice chronological kind of bookending, because I think what Foucault expresses is how it becomes progressively more and more difficult to allow the object of critical theory, which is the world and its possibilities and its repressed possibilities. It becomes more and more difficult to allow that to speak through critical theory, and so the kind of high wire approach of an Adorno and Horkheimer in Foucault becomes, I feel, even more attenuated, where on the one hand you have the pure despair of the horrors of the present and the insane hopes of the kind of most minor adjustment. That this increasing distantiation, I think, raises the ultimate question, which is just when anyone today, as academics, as political people, etc., attempts to critique the status quo, it can only be in the absolute intense knowledge of that it's almost impossible to do so, and that I'll leave it with that.
Thomas Mann writes Magic Mountain in 1924. It is set, however, in the world before the First Great War. It concerns the life in a sanitarium high in the hills of Switzerland. They live with the recognition that death is soon to come upon them, but they seek to continue their lives almost unconsciously. Yes, I think it is true that we live in a world that is, at least the small part of the world that we live in, we are lucky enough, I hope all of us, to live in a world that is recognizably bourgeois, that we can still call to be capitalist. I think we need to face the fact that probably within the next 100 years, humanity will descend to something worse than capitalism. Adorno called it, integrated civilization. It's also can be described as barbarism. The recognition of this is, however, not meant to produce despair, or if it is a despair, it would be a despair that would be productive, aggressive, critical, and not accommodate itself to the death spasms of bourgeois civilization.
All right, thank you all for joining us. You all deserve a gold star. Please do join us for lunch after this panel. If you're interested in learning more about platypus and like what we do, please visit us online at www.platypus2017.org, or if you want to get involved here in Chicago, let me know. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause.